On Tuesday morning, September 3rd, 2002, 15,500 truck drivers, mechanics, and dock workers pulled up to their terminals and found padlocks on the gates. There was no warning or severance, just a piece of paper pinned to the fence telling them 73 years of history was over. This wasn't just a bankruptcy. It was the ultimate Labor Day blindside, and the corporate maneuvering that caused it started years before the doors ever locked. To understand what was lost on Labor Day 2002, you have to understand what Consolidated Freightways actually was. Not the PR version, but the mechanical reality of running a national less-than-truckload carrier. LTL freight is not truckload. That distinction matters more than most people outside the industry realize. A truckload carrier picks up a full trailer from one shipper and delivers it to one consignee. It's simple, linear, and relatively cheap to run. LTL is a completely different animal. You're consolidating partial shipments from multiple shippers into a single trailer, moving that trailer to a hub, breaking it down, resorting freight by destination, reloading into outbound trailers, and delivering to multiple stops. And CF had to do that every single day, across the entire country. The infrastructure required to do that at national scale is staggering. You need terminals in every major market. Not just drop lots, but full-service freight houses with dock doors, forklifts, freight scales, freight bills, manifests, and skilled dock workers who know how to handle hazardous materials, fragile freight, and irregular commodities without destroying them or themselves. You need line haul drivers running overnight between those terminals, keeping schedules tight enough that the freight sorted at 11 p.m. makes the outbound trailer leaving at 2 a.m. You need mechanics keeping the equipment rolling, because a broken down power unit on I-80 at midnight doesn't just cost you the repair. It costs you the entire freight load sitting in that trailer that was supposed to be on a delivery dock in the morning. That system is called hub and spoke. CF ran it better than almost anyone during its peak years, and they built most of the playbook that the industry still uses today. Leland James founded the company on April 1st, 1929, in Portland, Oregon. What he did that was genuinely smart, not corporate retrospective smart, but operationally smart, was merge 4 separate short-haul carriers into a single unified LTL operation. Those 4 companies were running partial, overlapping routes in the Pacific Northwest, and operating independently with all the inefficiency that creates. James consolidated the billing, the terminals, the equipment, and the routes into one coherent system. That's the core logic of LTL. Consolidation creates efficiency that individual small carriers can't achieve. The timing was brutal. He launched a freight company 1 year before the Great Depression hit full force. And yet, they survived, not by retreating, but by expanding carefully into adjacent markets, building the terminal network piece by piece through the 1930s while competitors folded. In 1939, CF did something that would define their identity for decades. They built Freightways Manufacturing, an in-house division, specifically to design and produce custom trucks and trailers built to CF's operational specifications. This wasn't vanity. The equipment available commercially in the late 30s wasn't built for the demands of long-haul LTL freight. CF needed heavier-duty, better configured equipment, so they built their own. That division eventually became Freightliner, one of the most recognized names in heavy trucking. They spun it off, grew it, and in 1981, CF sold it to Daimler-Benz. But the origin is there. CF was sophisticated enough in 1939 to understand that if you couldn't buy what you needed, you built it yourself. Post-World War II, American manufacturing and commerce exploded, and CF expanded with it. They grew from a regional Pacific Northwest carrier into a genuine national operation through the 1940s and 50s, acquiring 53 companies by the end of the 50s alone. In 1951, they went public. By the time Jack Sneed was running the company through the 1955 to 1970s era, CF was one of the largest common carriers in the United States. Peak employment exceeded 15,000 workers. Teamster represented freight workers under the National Master Freight Agreement with real wages, real benefits, real pension contributions, and real seniority. That meant something. Guys who started on the dock in 1955 were still there in 1975, bidding the runs they wanted because they had earned the right. Their kids grew up knowing what their father did for a living and knowing there was a job waiting if they wanted it. That's not nostalgia. That's a description of a functioning industrial labor system that provided genuine economic stability to working-class families across the country. If you want a single date that put CF on the road to that locked gate in 2002, it's 1980. Specifically, the Motor Carrier Act of 1980, signed by Jimmy Carter on July 1st of that year. Before 1980, the Interstate Commerce Commission regulated trucking the way the FAA regulates aviation. You couldn't just decide to haul freight on a new route. You had to apply for operating authority, demonstrate public need, and survive challenges from existing carriers who didn't want your competition. Freight rates were set collectively and filed with the ICC. Entry barriers were high. Competition was structured and controlled. For established carriers like CF, those operating authorities were valuable because they protected decades of route development, terminal investment, and customer relationships. The Motor Carrier Act tore that protection away. Entry barriers collapsed, rates were thrown open to competition, and the operating authorities CF had spent decades building, and in some cases paid real money to acquire, lost most of their value almost overnight. What followed was exactly what basic economics predicts when you remove entry barriers from a labor-intensive industry: a flood of low-cost, non-union competitors willing to cut rates to the bone to build market share. By the early 80s, freight rates had fallen 25% in real terms. In an industry where your costs are mostly fixed, you've got terminals, equipment, pension obligations, and a unionized workforce with a national contract. A 25% rate reduction is catastrophic. The new carriers didn't have CF's pension obligations, NMFA labor costs, or aging terminal network. They could undercut CF because they were built for the new market, and shippers moved freight to whoever could move it cheapest. The industry got ugly fast. Established carriers went bankrupt. New non-union carriers entered the market. Driver wages and working conditions came under pressure as companies looked for any costs they could cut. CF survived the 80s, but they came out smaller, with thinner margins, and a cost structure that made it harder to compete against regional non-union carriers taking the shorter, more profitable hauls. When they sold Freightliner in 1981, the sale generated cash, but it also showed CF was starting to sell pieces of its legacy to stay alive. Through the late 80s and into the 90s, CF was in a structural bind that had no clean solution. They were running a national long-haul, LTL network, with union labor costs and legacy obligations in a market that had been fundamentally repriced by deregulation. The profitable growth was happening in regional LTL, shorter hauls, faster transit times, lower operating costs. And the carriers winning that business were mostly non-union. The parent holding company, Consolidated Freightways, Inc., had recognized this and diversified. They owned Conway, a regional LTL carrier that was non-union and highly profitable. They owned Emery Worldwide in the air freight business. They owned Menlo Logistics. The corporate portfolio had genuinely profitable operations that were structurally insulated from the problems hammering the long-haul unionized LTL side. And in 1996, the people running CF Inc. decided to do something about that. The 1996 restructuring of CF Inc. has a clean corporate explanation. Separating businesses with different growth profiles and capital requirements allows each to be more efficiently managed and financed. That's what the press releases and investor presentations said. Here's what the workers saw. CF Inc. split into two separate publicly traded companies. The first was CNF Transportation Inc. They kept Conway, the profitable, growing, non-union regional LTL network. They also kept Emery Worldwide and Menlo Logistics. So CNF got the assets with growth trajectories, lower labor costs, and no national master freight agreement obligations. The second company was the newly independent Consolidated Freightways Corporation. And what did Consolidated Freightways Corp. get? It got the long-haul LTL operation, CF Motor Freight, with its full Teamster workforce, its NMFA labor obligations, its aging terminal infrastructure, its pension liabilities, and its deteriorating market position in a segment that had been getting squeezed for 15 years. Let's be direct about what that was. CNF took the profitable present and the profitable future. Consolidated Freightways Corporation got the legacy liabilities and the structural problems. The workers who had spent careers building CF's freight network, the dock workers, the line haul drivers, the mechanics, the dispatchers, they ended up in the company that got the debt and the cost problems, while the shareholders and management who engineered the split protected the profitable operations in a separate entity that had no exposure to what was coming. The NMFA, the National Master Freight Agreement, is central to why the split mattered. It set wages, benefits, seniority rights, working conditions, and pension contributions for Teamster freight workers. For workers, it meant stability. For carriers, it meant higher fixed labor costs that couldn't easily be cut when non-union competitors started hauling freight cheaper. When CF Motor Freight was left standing alone as Consolidated Freightways Corporation in 1996, the problem was already baked in. The market had moved against long-haul LTL. Regional carriers had taken the shorter, more profitable hauls. What remained was the longer, thinner, harder business. Between 1996 and 2002, Consolidated Freightways was in a financial crisis that unfolded one quarter at a time. The numbers were bad, but the company kept operating, kept making payroll, and kept moving freight. To most workers, it looked serious but survivable. That's not irrational. CF had survived the Depression. It had survived World War II and deregulation. It had $2 billion in revenue as recently as 2001. It held roughly 15% of the market segment. You don't just watch a company that size disappear overnight, but that is exactly what happened. The 2 years before the shutdown were defined by sustained losses that the company could not reverse. Revenue was holding, but the operating costs, terminals, equipment, labor, fuel, insurance, consistently outpaced what they were bringing in on freight rates. In a low-margin business like LTL, you don't need massive losses to create a liquidity crisis. You just need consistent negative cash flow over long enough to exhaust your credit facilities and your insurer's patience. The labor agreement was a complicating factor in a very specific way. The National Master Freight Agreement covering CF's Teamster workforce was set to expire in April 2003. That created a kind of suspended reality in 2001 and into 2002. Management and workers both knew a renegotiation was coming, and both sides understood that the company's financial situation would be front and center in those negotiations. The general expectation was that CF would survive to that point, negotiate a contract that addressed the cost structure, and continue operating in some form. That expectation was shattered by what happened in the summer of 2002. The company's workers' compensation coverage, mandatory insurance for on-the-job injuries, was pulled by its insurers and surety providers in the summer of 2002. That was not a paperwork problem. Without workers' comp coverage, CF couldn't legally keep operating. The loss of workers' comp coverage meant CF had to scramble to replace it. And the fact that a surety bondholder had looked at the company's financial condition and decided to walk away told the rest of the financial community exactly how bad things were. CF went to its lenders for emergency financing to stabilize the situation. The lenders looked at the same financial picture the surety bondholder had looked at and said no. CEO John Brinko described the company's situation as critical. Workers knew something was wrong, but they were not given the full picture: the canceled insurance, the rejected financing, or the bankruptcy discussions happening above the terminal floor. Labor Day weekend became the final window. Once the surety coverage collapsed and emergency financing was rejected, leadership made the decision to file Chapter 11 and cease operations. Whether the timing was deliberate or simply the product of a crisis that could no longer be managed, the result was the same. Too many workers got no warning. That was what made the weekend different. CF workers were not being asked to vote on concessions, prepare for layoffs, or ride out one more ugly contract fight. By then, the company was no longer trying to negotiate its way out. From the terminal floor, the work still looked normal. Freight was in the system. Equipment was assigned. Loads still had to be broken, built, and moved. But somewhere above them, the company had already run out of time. By the time most employees found out, there was nothing left to argue over. The company was not asking for patience or sacrifice. It was already gone. You have to think about what that morning was for the people involved. Some drivers were mid-run when the shutdown happened, leaving equipment and freight stranded away from the terminals. Dock workers showed up expecting to sort the inbound that had piled up over the weekend. Mechanics had units waiting for service before the week's runs started. Instead, there was a locked gate and a notice. The notice said, Chapter 11, Bankruptcy, Immediate Cessation of Operations. CF was not restructuring to keep the freight moving. The company was done, the doors were locked, and the freight was stranded. Legally, Chapter 11 is meant for restructuring, but management used it as a loophole to liquidate the company, locking the gates immediately so they could auction off the fleet and real estate. There was no severance. Whatever CF owed workers under the labor agreement went into the bankruptcy estate with everything else the company owed. Men and women who had given CF 20 or 30 years became unsecured creditors. The people who get paid last, if they get paid at all. The pension situation deserves specific attention because it's where the long-term damage to individual workers was most severe. The Central States Pension Fund, the multi-employer pension fund that covered Teamster freight workers, was already under significant stress before CF collapsed. Multi-employer pension funds work on the assumption that contributing employers stay in business and keep contributing. When a major contributing employer like CF exits, not just reduces contributions, but exits entirely, the fund loses that income permanently while still being obligated to pay benefits to the workers who earned them. CF's collapse accelerated a funding problem that would haunt Central States for decades. For individual CF workers who were close to retirement or who had counted on their Central States benefit as the foundation of their retirement income, the implications were serious. Not immediately. Pension benefits don't disappear the day a contributing employer goes bankrupt. But the fund's long-term health, and therefore the security of their promised benefits, was real. This wasn't abstract financial risk. This was the retirement security of tens of thousands of people who had spent careers doing physical work with the understanding that the pension they were building was real. To understand why CF's collapse hit so hard, look at what had already happened to Union Freight. In the 70s, before deregulation, hundreds of thousands of Teamster-represented freight workers hauled under the National Master Freight Agreement. By September 2002, that number had fallen to about 80,000 nationwide. CF's 15,500 workers were not a footnote in that decline. They were nearly one-fifth of the Union Freight workforce still standing. In one single morning, a massive piece of what remained of the traditional unionized trucking industry was wiped off the map.